In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno argued that culture today is infecting everything with sameness. Pop culture under capitalism is mass-produced like goods in a factory, and even art that appears to rebel against the system ultimately follows the same underlying logic. The culture industry thus produces a standardized global mass culture that they saw as an especially perfidious form of mass deception. In many popular accounts of critical theory, the concept of the culture industry is often reduced to the claim that late-stage capitalism produces nothing but junk because all aspects of modern culture are commodified and subordinated to the industrial logic of capitalism. A few soulless products of popular culture are then presented as proof that Horkheimer and Adorno must have been right. However, the original concept of the culture industry is much more complex and, as I hope to show, quite problematic. In this video, I want to approach the theory of the culture industry by taking a look at the worst excess of this industry according to Adorno: jazz. First, I will outline some of the characteristics of Adorno's critique of jazz and contrast it with other critiques of the time. After that, I will present a specific aspect that plays an important part in Adorno's theory of modern music, namely his critique of repetition. And lastly, I will briefly discuss the general problems and limitations of Adorno's critical sociology of music. In the course of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, a new, unique conception of music developed in Europe. Art could be experienced as a retreat from society. This was followed by the development of a psychological way of thinking. 19th century psychology was heavily involved in the construction of a private inwardness to which a certain depth could be attributed. According to the cultural critics of the 20th century, a musical piece had to display a particular technical complexity and depth in order to pass as real music. The depth of jazz, according to most critics, stemmed from the close connection that African Americans supposedly had with nature and savagery. Take, for example, the Swiss conductor Ernest Ansermet, who is often credited with being one of the first so-called serious musicians who showed some approval of jazz. In 1919, he wrote an essay about his fascination for jazz and attributed a certain depth to it. However, he was unsure whether the depth of the black musician was genuine. He came to the conclusion that it was mainly an expression of wild nature, barbarism, and possession. Other critics also went into the technical details of the jazz pieces, but essentially it was about denouncing or celebrating the alleged primitivism and savagery of jazz. To the frustration of Adorno fans, Adorno is most famous for his dislike of jazz. While I was looking for essays on the culture industry, I repeatedly came across essays asking what kind of jazz Adorno actually disliked. It seemed to be the most pressing question among Adorno scholars for quite some time. But although his admirers tried to relativize Adorno's disdain, eventually they accepted that Adorno simply didn't like jazz. Any kind of jazz. It is true that he wrote more about other musical genres, but jazz played an important role in his work. He was involved with jazz in the Weimar Republic, but also in exile in England and America, where, according to his colleagues, he listened to all kinds of jazz music, not just bad jazz, as some claim. And after his return to West Germany, he continued to study jazz. All in all, his dismissive criticism was fairly consistent over time. But the fact that he didn't like jazz is not the problem. The problem lies in the reductionist approach to modern music and, ultimately, at the core of critical theory. But first, let's look at how his critique differs from that of the usual cultural critics of his time. Adorno's criticism mostly refrained from the openly racist stereotypes and was more concerned with standardized rhythms and normed improvisations. He discarded the descriptions of jazz as an expression of natural instincts and wildness as pure ideology. For Adorno, jazz was essentially a perfected product of the culture industry. He was not concerned about the origins of jazz in the African American community. Instead, he saw it in the tradition of salon music and marching music. Moreover, jazz can be completely reduced to its commodity character. It is an expression of the division of labor, factory life, and mass marches. Adorno claimed that jazz music creates a rhythmically submissive type. It only reflects capitalist society. He wrote, however, the modes of behavior that have developed in the production sphere on the assembly line spread potentially across society as a whole, including sectors where work is not done directly according to those schemes. Adorno's most famous text on jazz is a piece from 1936, simply entitled On Jazz. The essay contains extremely condescending remarks about jazz musicians, jazz listeners, musical amateurs, and all aspects of jazz music. Only on rare occasions did Adorno speak positively about jazz, when he praised the virtuoso performances of some jazz musicians, but never without immediately relativizing it. The essay was written as a critique of ideology. Jazz exists to hide something. Everything is just pseudo. Pseudo-subjectivity, pseudo-improvisation, and pseudo-democratic. The music conceals the class differences, the barbarity, the commodity character. It only produces illusions of the new, of freedom, individuality, and vitality. This Marxist critique is then connected with psychoanalysis. Jazz's alleged connection with the primitive wildness that is said to account for its depth and vitality made it a favorite object of psychoanalytic theories. In his Freudian analysis, Adorno came to the conclusion that the way instruments are played in jazz blurs the difference between the genders. He wrote, "It is impossible to characterize a mute trumpet as male heroic, impossible to describe the anthropoid tone of the saxophone as the voice of a noble maiden." All in all, for Adorno, jazz is essentially an emasculation. He wrote, "In any case, the typeface of jazz seems to contain the same threat of castration as that of the jazz orchestra with the winglet open." The quote about the open piano comes from an addendum to his text on jazz, in which he doubled down on the alleged proximity of jazz and fascism. One of his arguments goes like this: if you pronounce the word jazz in German, it sounds like Jazz. Jazz sounds a bit like Hatz, an old German word for hunt. Adorno then associates this word with the hunting of bloodhounds, which again reminds him of castration. This strange line of reasoning was probably inspired by an obscure and today rightly forgotten psychoanalytic book entitled Man as Symbol. To be fair, Adorno did not use these arguments again, and even somewhat distanced himself from certain interpretations of Freud's psychoanalysis, but his position remained that jazz was essentially emasculating, alienating, and fascist. The cultural critics of the time saw similarities between modern music and the repetitive machine work in the factories. Many journalists, philosophers, and music critics were keen to portray 20th century music as repetitive and soulless machine sounds. Since jazz, swing, and so on are not at all like this, they had to create the impression with their vocabulary. For example, instead of jazz dancer, they used expressions like those who follow the music motorically and thus become part of the machine's way of being. In Germany, the bias against repetition in music was so strong that, ironically, the arguments of the critics repeated themselves in the public debate about techno music in the 1990s. Adorno was one of the most prominent critics of repetition in music. He associated it with the monotonous work in the factory. Man is only an appendage of the machine that imposes its repetitive rhythms on him. He wrote, "The bodily functions that rhythm imitates are themselves, in the mechanical rigidity of their repetition, identical to those of the production processes that deprive the individual of bodily functions. What they hope to flee from, they do not let go." In his History of the Loop, Tilman Baumgärtel comes to the following conclusion. Adorno can only view the rhythm of popular dance music as stereotypical and formulaic. For him, their rhythm only imitates the mindlessly pounding structures of the mechanical means of production. But to Adorno's chagrin, it was in the second half of the 20th century, with the invention of the tape, that the loop began its triumphant advance in pop music. In the 1950s, the repetitions that the musicians implemented were not yet discernible in the looped pieces. For instance, the echo in Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel was created by a loop. Presley's producer Sam Phillips experimented with predecessors of the audio tape loop and created the slapback delay that most people will immediately associate with rock and roll. Beginning in the mid-1960s, artists became courageous enough to compose music with obvious loops, such as Terry Riley's In C. Contrary to the representatives of critical theory, Baumgärtel does not show in his History of the Loop how dance music reflects factory life, but how the dull, mindless beat of the machines could become a rhythm for dancing. At the climax of Baumgärtel's book, Donna Summer appears, who, as if it were a comment on Adorno, repeats in her incredibly influential I Feel Love in endless affirmations, "It's so good." In his Sociology of Music, Adorno fiercely attacked sociological reductionism. He wanted to protect music from a sociologism that only took social aspects into account without including the work itself in its objectivity. Yet this principle was applied rather selectively. While Adorno defended a small canon of avant-garde works against sociological reduction, he treated most other forms of music, that is, radio music, film music, and jazz, as little more than expressions of the totally administered world. So, for Adorno, only music which is not really art should be the subject of sociology. As the music sociologist Antoine Ennion has pointed out, it is difficult to know if this is more disrespectful of popular music or sociology. The only one who can escape the logic of the administered world is the critical theorist, the most advanced consciousness of humanity, in the words of the critical theorist Herbert Marcuse. And a select group of avant-garde works carry elements of the critique of society that allow the critical theorist to save them from his own sociological reductionism and integrate them into the critical enterprise itself. Adorno developed a quasi-Gnostic theory of art in which music becomes valuable only when it contains traces of the non-identical. Everything else is absorbed into what he called the nexus of deception. Yet, when Adorno writes about composers he admires, such as Gustav Mahler, he often abandons his rigid framework and produces genuinely interesting analyses. This encouraged some of his followers to extend the category of critical art to other musical styles, arguing that their favorite pieces of jazz, punk, or rock music are worth saving from identification with the culture industry. However, these attempts do not resolve the deeper theoretical problems within critical theory's approach to popular culture.